All right, so let's go ahead and move forward and look at economics and the economy of India and the Indian Ocean. So we have this phrase known as the Indian Ocean Basin, which is basically all the surrounding lands around the Indian Ocean. And the participation of trade along this basin is what we call the trade network of the Indian Ocean. And if you really want to go back all the way to time period one, the first kind of glimpses of this Indian Ocean trade network occurred between the Mesopotamians, right, or the Sumerians, and the Indus Valley. They had an oceanic trade, right, a maritime trade. It was very, very primitive, very, very minimum, but it did exist, right? So the Indian Ocean kind of traces all the way back to time period one, to the foundations period. But the Indian Ocean doesn't really expand until time period two, the classical era, and that's when we see the rise of the Persians, we see the Mauryans and the Guptas, we see that the Greeks and the Romans, right, even though they're in the Mediterranean, they're going to be sailing across the Red Sea and up and down the coast of Africa, eventually making their way to India. And we see that the Han Chinese, all the way over here, they're going to be sailing as well. So we're going to see this kind of huge network set up, begin to set up and begin to expand during the classical era. But eventually it will decline, right? It will kind of start declining around the 300s through the 500s, right, towards the end of the classical era, as a result of the collapse of the different classical empires, right? So the Han Chinese collapse, the Guptas collapse, the Romans collapse. And the end result is that with political disorder, political instability, trade begins to decline. But then something starts happening in the 700s. We see that the 600s and 700s, we see the birth of Islam in Arabia. We see the expansion of the Islamic or the Arab Empire throughout the Middle East and North Africa. And we see this new level of political stability. At the same time, we see the Sui and the Tang in China bringing back political order in China. So around the same time, these new empires are coming back to life, whether it's the Islamic one, the Caliphate, or whether it's the Chinese ones. And the end result is that we see rejuvenation, a rebirth of this trade network, and then we see kind of like explode, because now we see even further participation of more and more people from we talk about the Swahili city-states to the Southeast Asian islands, from China to Arabia. All these different places are going to start trading more than ever before. And of course, the merchants are going to be sailors. They're going to be sailing across the Indian Ocean using the monsoon winds that allows them to kind of like maximize their speed. The only problem, the downside of the monsoon winds, is that they're seasonal. So in a few months out of the year, they blow in one direction, and the other months they blow in a different one, which means that the sailors, once they land in their destination, they're kind of forced to live there for a few months before they're able to sail back home. So what starts happening is they start setting up their own communities in these foreign lands, and little by little we see that start mixing with the population, kind of like how the Arabs merchants had sailed to East Africa and settled down with African women, and eventually set up the Swahili culture. Same exact thing is going to happen, but all over the Indian Ocean. So we're going to see Jews sailing and settling in India. We're going to see Muslims in India. We're going to see Indians going to Southeast Asia. We're going to see Indians in Persia. We're going to see Chinese people in Southeast Asia. We're going to see Chinese people in India. And we're going to see kind of this mix and matching of these different merchant communities. So this is what we call the diasporic, right? Because these small communities of ethnic groups or religious groups are being formed in faraway lands, away from their original homeland. And this will rise in the development of these new, huge, what we call cosmopolitan, right? Very diverse, multi-ethnic, multi-religious, multi-linguistic cities. Places like Hormuz, which is in Persia. Calicut is probably the most important one when it comes to India. Calicut, Malacca, which we'll talk about later. Guangzhou, which is in China. Mombasa, which is one of the Swahili city-states. Alexandria, which is of course in Egypt. So we're going to see all these different ethnic groups and religious groups, racial groups, mixing and blending in together, creating kind of this multicultural cities. And these cities, of course, are going to grow because they're also ports and centers of trade and going to be very wealthy. Now, each one of these different regions that participate in the Indian Ocean Trade Network had something to offer. So, for example, India, their main exports would be stuff like cotton and steel and pepper. Southeast Asia are known as the Spice Islands because they produce a lot of spices, stuff like ginger and cinnamon and nutmeg and pepper. Swahili Africa, as we know, they're going to be doing the slaves and the ivory and the gold. China, the main one, of course, is silk and porcelain. In the Middle East, we have horses and figs, which are the fruit and aromatics. So the main thing we need to understand is that the number one traded item are going to be luxury goods, right? From all different regions, everyone's going to be trying to gather luxury goods, which means that the motivation or the drive behind this trade are the elites in each one of these societies, right? The upper class in China or in India or in Africa or in Arabia, right? They want to distinguish themselves as upper class, and therefore they want to have the fanciest, nicest things, the luxurious things in life that come from far, far away, that are very exotic to them. So even though the upper class are the driving force behind this trade, same case would apply to the Silk Road. There is the wealth or the economic opportunities of trade isn't just reserved to the upper class, right? Because it is merchants who are going to be making money by transporting all these goods back and forth. Also, because of their cargo ships, they're able to transport lots of stuff like timber or wood. That would be another trade item as well. So we've mentioned this before, but it's worth repeating. The Indian Ocean is a result of the diffusion of numerous technologies from one culture to the next, right? So we see that shipbuilding, whether it's the Chinese junks or the huge ships, or the Indian Ocean or the Indian dhows, right, which are a little bit smaller but they're faster, they are able to carry more cargo, which of course means more trade. Also, we see new technologies like the rudder, which is Chinese, the compass, which is Chinese, knowledge about the monsoons, the lateen sails, right, which is what the Indian dhows have, and the astrolabe, which goes back to the Greeks and the Romans. All right, quickly let's talk about Hinduism, and here we see a Hindu temple. The Hindu temples are always going to have these tall, kind of like towers. It's a very common feature in their architecture, and basically they're going to be very intricate, meaning there's a lot of sculptures and statues and stuff like that. So the Hindus, unlike the Muslims, right, they have no problem with displaying religious icons, religious images in their temples. And Hinduism is the main religion of India, right? Buddhism was a major one during the Mauryan Empire, but the fact is that by the time the Guptas collapsed, Hinduism is number one. Islam will come in eventually throughout the post-classical era and will grow in popularity and will become the second main religion. And Buddhism will kind of decline. Now, Buddhism declines for a few different reasons. One is that they were targeted by the Muslims, just like the Hindu temples were. So Buddhism declines because of that. Buddhism also declines because so many people travel elsewhere to spread the religion, right? So Buddhism, even though it kind of declines in India, we know that it is growing elsewhere, like specifically and especially China and East Asia. And we see Buddhism also spread to Southeast Asia. Now, Islam and Hinduism, these two religions, they're polar opposites, right? They are very much incompatible. So it's going to be it's going to be very, very hard to synchronize them, right? Because one is monotheistic, the other one is polytheistic. One has images, the other one does not. In Islam, we have the idea that all Muslims are equal in the caste system. The idea is, that everyone has a different value, different importance based on their caste system, right? Based on their karma. And in the Islam, there's only one book, while in Hinduism, there's a whole bunch of different books. In Islam, there's only one way of devotion, showing your devotion to God. In Hinduism, there's hundreds and hundreds of ways people practice Hinduism in many different ways. There isn't just like one way of doing things. While Islam says, the one way is, the 5 pillars. So, so we see obviously these two religions, as they grow in popularity, they're going to start conflicting with each other. And we mentioned already, Islam originally be entered through force, right? And including, of course, Mahmud of Ghazni. We go back to this picture, we see these would be people like Mahmud of Ghazni. Not only are they killing the priests and living in the temples, but they're destroying the shrines. They're destroying the gods, the statue of the Hindu gods. And this is, this idea of, forcing people by you destroy their temples, and in their place you build mosques and you force the people to convert. This policy does not really work, and the Hindus definitely reject it. On top of that, the sultans of Delhi, they're going to start charging the jizya tax, right, which is that tax against non-Muslims. And the problem is that in India, majority of the people are Hindus. That means majority of the people have to pay this extra tax. And this kind of brings a lot of problems and a lot of animosity against the rulers, against the sultan, because they're viewed as the minority, right? Because they are the minority of the population. Now, so the kind of the forced conversions, right, whether it's violence or economic forcing people through taxes, they don't really work, right? What does work and what in Islam grows in popularity is through merchants, right? And the Muslim merchants, the communities, they attract people to convert because they say that the merchants are doing well off, they're doing economically well. So they want people to convert, and they want people to, people want to convert because, they see that there's an economic opportunity for them. Now, the main people that are attracted to Islam, the ones most likely to convert, are lowercase Hindus, because they literally have nothing going for them. They have no opportunities, and they hope that by converting to Islam, then they're going to be equal, and therefore they're going to have equal opportunities. But that's really not what happens, right? Because even though you're considered equal, you're still treated unequally and not given any opportunities to improve your status. So merchants and trade, they're going to be the driving force in the spread of Islam. The other ones, of course, are going to be the Sufis, which you mentioned before when we looked at Africa. So the Sufis, they're missionaries. They are going to popularize Islam in India, and they don't stress so much about how to properly pray, or when you have to pray, or what books, how to read the Quran and stuff like that. Instead, they focus more on having a connection with God, right, between the person and the Supreme, right, between the person and Allah. And they come up with this idea that all the different versions of, all the different gods of Hinduism are really just different aspects of Allah, right? And this is actually a Hindu thing, because the Hindus also believe that all the different gods are just different representation, different manifestations of the supreme God, right, which is Brahma, the universal God. So this idea is easily kind of like, connects people from, bridges people from Hinduism into Islam. So because the Sufis are very open-minded, they don't tell the Hindus, you gotta pray like this, or you gotta do this, or you gotta do that. You just tell them, like, look, pray however you feel like praying. The whole point of praying is to connect yourself to God. So it doesn't matter how you do it, as long as you reach that goal. And this kind of like opens up the opportunity for people to become Muslim, right? So even though they might pray differently than they would say in Arabia or in the Middle East or in Egypt, right? They're going to practice Islam a slightly different way, but eventually they will practice Islam. They will convert, and we see the increased popularity of Islam in northern India. All right, interaction of Islam and Hinduism. So we see, of course, these two religions keep growing in popularity, and there is, that which leads to conflict between the supporters of each of the religions. But eventually, we see that more and more people are trying to find a way to combine, right? So there's an attempt to synchronize these two religions, and they're not really all that successful. But what we do see is that Hinduism changes, right? Because Islam becomes so popular, or is increasingly popular, the kind of like the Hindu leaders realize that, hey, we got to change the way we do things, because in Hinduism there's a lot of like ceremonies, there's a lot of rituals, there's a lot of ideas that the only ones who can connect or speak with the gods are the priests, which means that everyone else who's not a Brahmin or the upper class of the caste system doesn't have that connection. So imagine you're in a religion that the only people who can connect with the gods or with God are a tiny minority of people, all right, which is Hinduism, and then you have another religion, which is Islam, that says that everyone has that special connection to God, right? So obviously Hinduism has to change to keep people from switching over to Islam. Because if I'm a poor Indian, Hindu guy, and this new religion comes up and it's telling me that it offers salvation and that there is an eternal paradise and that I can have a connection with God, right? And my religion is telling me your life sucks because you did something bad in your previous life, and if you don't do what you're told, you're going to suffer again in the next life. When I look at those two options, Islam looks really good. So Hinduism changes, right, to counter the popularity of Islam, and they start coming up with ideas of how to have your own special connection to the different gods. So we see kind of that change within Hinduism. And another thing we see is that they stop discriminating against women, at least spiritual discrimination. Let me clarify. Because remember, under Hinduism, the only people who can reach, not nirvana, what's it called? Who can reach moksha, right, which is the release of the cycle of reincarnation. The only people who can do that are the priests, and the only ones who are priests are the men, right? So women will never be able to reach moksha, right? They're never able to have their souls, escape the cycle of rebirth. So that practice comes to an end. And again, part of the reason is because Islam is offering more equality, both spiritual and social, than Hinduism. So to keep women and keep lowercase people from switching over, Hinduism promotes these changes. And this is known as the bhakti movement, right? And these people, again, they're going around kind of preaching this new way of practicing Hinduism, and it is attracting people to keep with Hinduism and not convert to Islam. All right, going quickly, talking about Buddhism. So Buddhism, again, it declines throughout this time period in India, but it increases elsewhere. One of the famous people who is kind of like accredited for helping spread Hinduism is a monk, a Chinese Buddhist monk called Xuanzang, I think. And he traveled to India, he studies Buddhism, he goes back to China, he's super famous, he has all these books, he translates them, and people are studying Buddhism in China. We see Buddhism becomes more popular. We see how Buddhism in China convert or synchronizes with Taoism, right, creating Zen Buddhism. We see that Buddhism, there's going to be a lot of statues being built to kind of show their devotion to this new religion. And we also know that Buddhism will spread from China to other places like Korea, to Vietnam, and to Japan, right? All of East Asia. Buddhism will also change as it spreads, just like other religions will change as it spreads. So, for example, when Buddhism is adopted throughout Central Asia and through Tibet, right, which is now part of China, the people of Central Asia and the people of Tibet, they have a long tradition of belief in magic. So their Buddhism starts adopting or believing in magic things, right? Like that people can have magical items or magical necklaces. So Buddhism alters that. When it goes to Southeast Asia, the Buddha becomes one of many gods, right? Because they are polytheistic. So the Buddha, who originally was just one, some like guy, some normal guy, in Southeast Asia, he's viewed not just as a guy, but as a god, and one of many actually. So they have different gods to pray to. So Buddhism changes, in variations and differences as it spreads to different parts of Asia. All right, going forward, the caste system, right? So here we have the famous caste system of India. The Brahmin are the upper class, the peasants are the lower class, we have merchants, we have warriors and kings in the middle and the upper. And of course you have the untouchables, the Dalits, they're the lowest of the low. In fact, they're not even considered part of the caste system, and this is, the people who do the filthiest, dirtiest jobs, they tend to be considered the untouchables. So the caste system, for all its problems, well, one thing it does do is that it provides stability, right? Social stability to a politically unstable region. Because the kingdoms change and they fought each other all the time, right? These small kingdoms throughout India, right? The caste system provides some form of stability, because regardless of who's the king or who's the new ruler, everyone knows their place in society, right? The upper class know that they're upper class, the middle class know that they're middle class, and the lower class know their role as the lower class people. So that means every society will continue, regardless who's in charge, who's the political leader. It doesn't matter, because Indian society continues as is because of the caste system. So it does provide some stability. And we see that the caste system not only provides stability, it is very flexible. So we see all these different people, whether it's Chinese people coming in or Muslim people coming in, all these migrants are coming in and merchants are coming into India, and now they're kind of starting to blend into Indian society. So the caste system expands, right? And these new migrants, they're going to start being placed into the caste system, into what are called the jatis or the sub-caste. So you have the 5 major groups, right? And then now we see new merchants coming in, right? So the merchants might come in here. We see migrants coming in. Well, the migrants are educated. They might, go to the top of the society. If the migrants come and they're, they have no skills, they're probably going to go to the bottom of society. But they're going to be kind of like broken up into different